There is 3 valves on an oxyacetalyn cutting torch. How are they used?
The lower 2 controls are for standard wire welding, soldering, or brazing. One valve is obviously for oxygen and the other for acetylene. When you add the cutting torch to the system, you then have the third valve. When using the cutting attachment, you would open the lower oxygen valve fully and adjust the upper valve for oxygen and the lower valve for acetylene.
What is the order in which you open the oxygen valves?
With the cutting torch on, you would open the lower oxygen valve fully, then open the acetylene valve and the upper oxygen valve slightly, then ignite the torch and adjust your upper oxygen valve to get a nice flame. To shut it down, close the acetylene valve, then the upper oxygen, then the lower oxygen.
After you start the acetylene, do you agit the flame by turning the upper oxygen valve or the lower one? In your last reply, you did not mention any use of the lower oxygen valve. When is it used?
With the cutting tip on, you would only be using the upper oxygen knob. Turn the lower oxygen knob open before you start anything. This allows the oxygen to flow past that valve and be controlled by the upper valve. The only time you would be using the lower valve to adjust is when you do not have the cutting tip on and you have only 2 valves. The upper oxygen valve takes the place of the lower one when the cutting tip is installed. You would make your flame adjustments with the upper oxygen valve after lighting the torch. Turn both the upper oxygen valve and the acetylene valves on slightly to light the torch, and then make your adjustments with the top oxygen valve.
I am confused. It may be that I have been confused by talking about different valves. I have been referring to the valves at the place where the oxygen and acetylene hoses attach to the torch as the upper valves. The small valve that is located underneath the torch about halfway down to the tip of the torch I have been referring to as the lower valve. Do we agree?
Is the third valve you are talking about further away from the hose connections than the other is in closer to the tip of the torch?
Yes.
Follow my instructions, keeping in mind that the way I have been describing the controls is with the lower controls as the 2 knobs directly at the hose connections and the upper oxygen valve being the one closest to the flame tip. Let me know if that makes more sense.
I kind of had it backwards. I was referring to the upper valve as the one next to the hose connection. The valve closer to the tip I referred to as the lower valve, where you referred to it as the upper valve. It has just occurred to me that when the cutting tip is in place, the oxygen flow is controlled only by the upper, yours, oxygen valve. Rereading your replies with the change in labeling of the valves now makes sense. What setting would you use on the acetylene?
I turn both valves open about a half turn. Light it up and adjust T from there.
Thanks. I will give it a try.
If you have a home improvement or appliance question and want to chat with an expert now, visit justanswer.com/ythi.